Hello and welcome to a polling station special. This was initially intended to be just a review of Labour Party conference and just to look back, particularly what's gone on over the week. But as I speak, Labour have finally done it. They're not 20 points ahead, they're 30 points ahead or 33 points ahead, depending on where you look. So that requires a lot of discussion from some very talented people, and I'm very pleased to be joined by not only good friend and regular on the show, Paul Krishnamurty, but also Tessa Milligan of Open Labour and Chris Hopkins of Savanta Comrades to look into everything over the last week or so. And God, it really has only been a week. So just want to start actually with you, Chris, first of all. Thanks for joining us and explain a little bit what's driving such big poll leads for Labour. I mean, 30 points, who would have believed it?
Yeah, not me, I have to say. I had to leave my office pretty early yesterday, and then I got off the tube to a flurry of texts which were along the lines of, have you seen the YouGov? And it turned out I hadn't seen the YouGov, but when I had, or when I did, yeah, quite a few double takes before I was quite got my head around the size of the lead. And then plugging that into seat predictors, it just shows a complete annihilation. I think the chances of, without pouring a load of cold water on another pollster's work, because I wouldn't want to do that, I think Anthony Wells's reaction yesterday was a bit like, eek. And I think he knows that that's very unlikely to replicate itself at an election. But ultimately, polls are a snapshot in time, and 20 points, 30 points, 33 points, it's indicative of the state of play at the moment. And I think we released an MRP poll with Labour List at Labour Conference that was published on the Sunday of conference, so just shy of a week ago. And the fieldwork was a little bit more dated, so probably about a week and a half old now, that fieldwork. But that showed Labour with a 12-point lead, taking a 56-seat majority. And I'm sitting on that panel, and right now, in hindsight, I look a bit silly because I'm just saying, well, that if that lead was to go 1 point the other way, and Labour's majority is going to be a lot smaller, and Labour have to be really, really. They can't afford to be complacent, and the lead's really precarious. And then throughout the time that we were at conference with him, that we saw another 14-point lead, another 17-point lead, and now, as you say, we're to combat the meme, we're over 20%. And I think that a lot of the fieldwork that was taken, our latest poll is 14 points and a 14-point lead, but that fieldwork was Friday, Saturday, Sunday of Labour conference. That may have captured some public interest in the mini budget. I think that the public are probably going to look at that mini budget, or would have looked at that mini budget during our field work and gone, well, don't like a banker's bonuses cap, don't like abolishing the top rate, but I do like the cut in the basic rate, and I do like the reversal in NI. And they've gone, well, probably not really much different from where we were. Yes, okay, it might be a mini budget for the rich, but ultimately it didn't change a lot. And then the IMF intervention happened, which is unprecedented, and the Bank of England intervention happened, which is unprecedented, and all of the media has been pro-Labour, anti-Conservative, and any fieldwork that's been conducted since those interventions has just shown a giant lead. And yeah, I think that the state of play, therefore, to answer your original question, is very much like, it's a bit of both. I think there was positivity at a Labour conference, and I think that people, that they're going to shore up their vote, and maybe they'll attract a few more switchers. But I think that this is Conservative voters just going, I cannot in good faith at the moment vote for the party that I would ordinarily vote for. And yeah, they might be switching to don't know, and that exacerbates a polling lead. But at the same time, there's a very little from the government and Truss and Kwarteng at the top of the party at the moment that I think appeals to your on average on the street Conservative voter, hence the lead.
Indeed. On that note, we have had a big market move, of course, in the next general election. Labour are now 1 to 3 to win the most seats and they're even money as I speak for a majority. That's 75% and 50%, which I think even sort of a month ago or even maybe 2 weeks ago, I don't think people would have been that confident in the markets. What have you made of it, Paul?
Well, the swing in the betting is just unprecedented. I mean, you know, I have been strongly of the view that Labour would form the next government for quite a while because the Tories don't have any allies. But, you know, even saying 10 days ago, I thought that the market was overreacting at about 1.8 on Betfair, just because I thought, you know, Truss will get at least a short honeymoon and Labour's lead was soft. But, you know, the worst expectations of Truss have been realised already. And, you know, I mean, feeding what Chris said about the media narrative, I mean, I've always taken the view that this is pivotal. This is absolutely pivotal. The average swing voter is not particularly engaged in the detail of politics, and it is about the broad feel of the media narrative. And, you know, all my life, apart from maybe when Tony Blair was leader, that has been systematically anti-Labour, that narrative, right? And it's very, very hard. And suddenly they have just, you know, committed suicide in plain sight. I mean, after that budget, not only was the budget unbelievably tone deaf, but they all came out, their supporters came out and just cheered it to the rafters and looked ridiculous by the end of the day. You know, and Truss's response this week, I mean, that round of local interviews, well, first saying nothing, right? Secondly, their failure to understand that the markets needed some kind of reassurance and needed some kind of OBR report or something. That's incredible. That's so un-Tory-like to misread the markets like that. But to go on the local, to choose to do local news interviews with journalists who, you know, are going to be itching for a chance to have a crack at the new Prime Minister, when they'd be far better off just going on BBC and having a really easy interview with Chris Mason or something. So it looks completely inept. The conference is going to be, I assume, a debacle. And suddenly you're in existential crisis territory, because I don't think they're going to get rid of Truss in the short term. I don't think they're going to U-turn too much in the short term. So, you know, it just becomes an ongoing car crash. And furthermore, I thought that, I know it's kind of like secondary news now, but the Labour conference was very impressive. I think that what's happened this week has really vindicated what Keir Starmer's been doing for the last 2 years. And they are now in a superb position.
On that note, who better to go to then? Tessa Milligan of Open Labour. Actually, let's start on conference. What were the best bits of it for you?
I have to say, it started off sort of cautiously optimistic, and as the week went on, it really did become more and more like a celebration. With every speech from shadow secretaries of state, it obviously started with the singing on the first day. Last year, there was some heckling of the leader. There was none of that this year. There was no heckling. The only heckling there ever was, you know, the classic, you know, conference floor debates about motions and this, that, and the other. The disagreement in the party and the debate was limited to panel discussions at fringe events and debates on conference floor about motions. Outside of that, the party was incredibly unified in a way that I haven't seen really in a very long time. That's not to say there wasn't debate and discussion and disagreement, but there was a real feeling that, you know, we've had this sort of incredible comeback as a party, that we've gone from the absolute devastation of the 2019 general election, where, you know, unlike Paul, I was thinking we're not going to be in power until, you know, the term after next, maybe, if we can turn it around. And we were sort of focused on how do we build to maybe even potentially a hung parliament. And now seeing the polls come out this week, that, you know, it's not just showing us a big Labour lead, but getting to the point where we may surpass the sort of 50% of voters mark, and that is really where it's at for us because of first past the post and how these things play out. You know, we've had a situation where, you know, the Conservatives haven't really needed 50% of the vote to get a majority in the House of Commons. It is generally under first past the post much harder for Labour to see the sort of same outcome in terms of numbers of seats on an equally or similarly high percentage rate of the vote. But we're now heading towards this place where once we tip over the sort of 50% mark, I think it's going to be very, very hard in the short amount of time that the Tories have before the next general election to be able to claw that back. They are obviously the experts in reinvention, but they've done this sort of strange thing with Liz Truss where they seem to have mistaken reinvention for setting fire to your own coalition of voters. I mean, and it's not just, you know, the city boys who sort of freaks out at this budget, and rightly so, I would say, but also, you know, homeowners, landlords, anyone with a mortgage or anyone who was hoping to get a mortgage, and also pensioners who will have read headlines this week that their pension pots were nearly wiped out if potentially if the Bank of England hadn't stepped in and intervened in a totally unprecedented way in the gilts market. So, you know, I don't know what on earth is happening in number 10, but they are surely surrounded by yes men who are cheering this kind of stuff on. And as a Labour Party member, I'm torn between thinking, yeah, go on, you listen to the IEA and you take all that advice you can from Kate Andrews from The Spectator. The other half of me is thinking, I've got bills to pay. There's a cost of living crisis. It's becoming increasingly hard to budget. I'm currently wearing my several layers of clothing because I don't want to turn the heating on. And the other part of me is thinking, actually, please don't tank the economy because, you know, might be great for people who want Labour to win that general election, but it's also not good for many of us on a personal level. And secondly, there's going to be a hell of a mess to clean up for a Labour government that does get in, because there'll be a lot of pledges and promises that have been put together, policies that have been put together based on research that was done before this sort of bizarre economic turn from Liz Truss and this pursuit of these frankly insane policies in some regards. And Paul's right, the budget was completely tone deaf. It's less so about the details. You know, most people aren't sitting, you know, poring over, you know, the Financial Times and Bloomberg and all this kind of thing. But people get the headlines that, you know, people, and not just headlines, but things that are happening in their own lives. That woman who's gone viral on Question Time saying she had an offer 2 weeks ago for a mortgage with 4.5% interest rate, and they've come back today, rescinded that offer, and now it's 10.5%. And you had the audience audibly gasp at that. That's going to be happening hundreds of times over across the country. I'd be really, really keen to hear, because obviously I'm not a pollster, but I'd be really keen to hear your guys' thoughts on how this might impact Scotland, because, you know, we kind of do see with the SNP, it'd be interesting to see what happens when voters in Scotland, you know, get the sense that Labour might win, you know, in England, and what that might mean for essentially the ending of Tory rule being in reach.
I think that's a really good point, particularly about Scotland. I mean, one of the things I'd say is that it looks from over here that Scottish voters have an anti-Tory option, albeit that anti-Tory option is really supporting independence, or for those who are reasonably aligned with the SNP. So it's not everybody, and there are definitely votes to be won, but I think a lot would depend on the cultural and economic sensitivities of, you know, those. There is, I mean, Chris, is there, doing a bit of a deep dive into this for we move on, is there much scope in Scottish voters to move from Conservative to Labour, at least?
Yeah, there could be. I think it's to what extent that then has an impact on the seats at a general election. We are in field now, as of today, with a Scotland poll that will be out next week. So I don't want to speak or speculate too much when I'm going to have data next week. But I do think it's an interesting point. I guess, yeah, in terms of Labour needing some, Labour needed Scotland to help them under first past the post ultimately, and maybe it doesn't anymore. Maybe based on some of these numbers, it can almost win only in England, and it could be fine. But I think there are Scottish Conservative votes to be won for the Labour Party. I think that it's to what extent that affects the seat by seat sort of distribution, particularly when the SNP are so strong in so many seats. And yes, there are marginals, and Labour will need to try and really squeeze that unionist vote down ultimately, because I don't think there are going to be loads of SNP switchers that might all of a sudden go, well, okay, the Tories in England are falling apart, therefore I've always voted SNP in Scotland because of an anti-Tory sentiment, but now I can go back to Labour. I don't think that exists in quite the same way. I still think Labour's job north of the border really is to squeeze that unionist vote down and to take those. If say in a constituency we're seeing Labour on 20, the Tories on 20, and the SNP on 45, then Labour has to squeeze that Conservative 20 down, I would say, in order to try and win some seats from the SNP. Where they are a little bit more marginal, but yeah, I think let's wait and see what the fieldwork says and what the data says when we release this next week.
Quick fire question: what's the lowest Labour could get to? I mean, this is obviously very hypothetical, but what is the rough band of percentage that Labour could gain and win a majority without Scotland? Just presuming that the SNP stay on, like, say, 7%, actually get like 50 seats.
Yeah, I mean, I think based on our MRP work last week, I think that a Labour majority evaporates with about a 9-point lead. I think a 10-point lead for them would get them majority between like 8 and 13, and then at 9 you're looking at maybe being short by 4, maybe having a majority of 1 or 2. I would think so. So yeah, that's like I say, that was the basis of my fringe event with Labour List. How precarious is this lead? And then all of a sudden we saw a 33-point lead yesterday. If that halves, Labour still absolutely wiped the Conservatives out. If you take some of the more modest Labour leads of 20, 21 points, if that halves, then yeah, Labour still might get a majority, and that's the position we're in now. I'm not saying Labour can afford to be complacent, but if they are genuinely 20 to 30 points ahead, that's a hell of a cushion to play with. And the other thing, as Paul said, and as we might come on to, and Tessa alluded to, it's hard to know how this can get any better at the moment for the Conservatives. Yes, okay, it might not be, the headlines won't stay as negative forever, but because of the sheer abandonment of their base, pensioners and who will have seen the pension fund headlines, and anyone that's got a mortgage or wants a mortgage, that aspirational person that the Conservatives do really well actually at tapping into, especially compared to the Labour Party. If people aren't going to get on the property ladder because of something the Tories have done, then how on earth are they supposed to win their vote? And I think that the rising cost of living and things related to it are going to be the key driver of the vote of votes at the next election. And if voters blame the Conservatives for all of the issues that they encounter over the next year or two, then yeah, I think it's going to be quite easy for them to seek an alternative with Keir Starmer's Labour Party.
Sorry, go on, Paul.
I do actually, I really do think this could become like a genuine existential crisis for the Conservative Party. I mean, when you compare this, we've all talked about Black Wednesday, for example. I lived through that time. The economy improved. They went into the 1997 election with a decent economic record and a story to tell about what they'd achieved over 18 years. And it was too late. They'd alienated so many people in that 92 to 94 period. This is on another scale. That it hasn't really hit people yet. You know, the energy bills are only beginning to hit people, and we're talking about, you know, inflation going forward, and then interest rates next year going through 6-7%. I really can see it just destroying them, pushing them down to sort of sub 25%. And then you've got the possibility that there's some kind of right-wing backlash, because one of the points about the Johnson coalition was he hoovered up a lot of far-right votes, right? UKIP is nothing now, BNP are nothing, English Democrats virtually disappeared. And if there is a large number of don't knows, dissatisfied on the Tory side who aren't going to switch to Labour or Lib Dems or Greens, well, you know, logic would say something will appear. You know, I'm sure Nigel Farage is viewing the situation and has plans. I don't necessarily think the Reform Party is it. Plus, you hear that Truss is going to ease immigration restrictions. So again, you know, they've just built this kind of very right-wing, socially conservative coalition, and those people are not the people who are going to buy into extreme right libertarianism, which is what we have. So, you know, we could be looking at a 1993 Canadian election situation here, where they were virtually wiped out.
I mean, it's going to be interesting. This is a long way in advance, but coming to the election, handicap seat betting, size of majority betting will be a thing, and it feels absolutely ridiculous to say, but if this situation holds, I'm sort of wondering what fancy speculative bets people might start having on the size of the Labour majority. You know, could it get to 50? Could we do an over under on the seats of that thing? And it seems absolutely remarkable that we're at that stage. Just to get a quick fire view on this, we are currently saying, or the market, at least with Star Sports, is currently saying it's a 50% chance that Labour wins a majority. All the factors included, do you think that's correct, incorrect, and why? I'm going to make you get yes or no answers, and I'm going to go with Tessa first.
I can't believe I'm saying this, but I think Labour, I'm really confident Labour will get a majority. For me, it's a question of how big. There's two options to a Tory party. They stick with Liz Truss. She carries on down this track because the people who are backing these ideas are where she gleans her political power from. Right, this is something really important to understand with the members. You do have a lot of these sort of pressure groups and things like that, economists who are backing her up. She's just been given a mandate by Tory party members for this specific economic plan. Now, that might be completely tone deaf in comparison to the party. It's ironic saying that as a Labour Party member, where we've been told Labour Party members are completely out of touch with the rest of the country. You know how the tables have turned. They either stick with that, which surely means more of this economic nightmare. Growth will be this sort of pursuit of growth. You know, growth for who is my first question.
Wow.
But second of all, it's yet to be seen, and it's yet to be felt. And will people feel it enough for the Tories to scrape through at the next general election, or you know, as the gossipers have been chatting about, do they get rid of Truss before the next general election and go with someone else? I think that would be a nail in the coffin for the Tory party leader. The Labour Party election posters would write themselves. You know, vote Tory and it's a lucky dip who you get for Prime Minister, because they keep changing and you have no idea. And people voted for Boris, and now Liz Truss has come along with basically a completely antithetical plan to what was in the 2019 manifesto. Levelling up is dead. This idea of investing in our regions and all this kind of thing for growth is dead. It's not about investment anymore. It's about tax cuts. It's about Reaganomics and growing the pie and all this sort of crap. And when you look at the polling, it suggests around 37% of people who voted Tory and delivered that majority would vote Tory again. And where are the rest of them? I mean, they're probably the don't knows, or they're the switchers to Labour, or in some parts of the country, they're probably thinking voting Lib Dem, like in the southwest, because they've taken a hammer now to not just the red wall with this budget, but also the blue wall. And this thing about aspiration is mostly a message which works for working age people. And when you look at how working age people voting, it's now overwhelmingly in Labour's favour, you know, and now the pensioners are reading the headlines. You know, the typical Tory voters reading the headlines thinking this isn't very good for me either. So I think Labour will win the next election. I don't think we should be complacent at all. I think it's going to take a lot of work because we don't have a full programme yet either. We only saw the sort of beginnings of that at this conference. It's looking very promising, but I think it's just a question of how big the majority is at this point.
Paul?
I agree with Tessa. Everything. Can't endorse that more. I wasn't confident before, but I am now.
Yeah, I agree with Tessa. It's going to be an election poster in the future, I should think.
Yeah.
Chris, 50%, all the factors included, is that about right or not?
Yeah, I think the sensible part of me wants to not overreact to a few polls, especially in a noisy period. But given the size of those leads, I think, you know, even money, I'll snap your hand off at the minute. I'm
inclined to agree with that. Now, Tessa, you made the point of the Tories potentially having a lucky dip for a new leader. And it's something that I cannot believe I'm saying this. It's literally only 75 days after Boris Johnson said he was going to step down. But we are at a situation now where our punters believe that Liz Truss is at the least more likely than not to face a vote of no confidence before the next general election. She's currently 4-7 with us, about 63% basically, to face a vote of no confidence. Yes, no answers from all three of you. Do you think she will face one before next election? I'll start with you, Chris.
I'd hedge that. I would say no, I don't think she will. And I think if she does, it is just one last final roll of the dice. But I think I'm not sure they'd do it again, especially so soon.
Paul?
Well, I don't actually think there will be a confidence vote, because I think if they're going to remove her, she'll resign. It's not like Boris Johnson, where there was at least a stack of MPs who support her. She's got such little support. I don't think she'll go through the humiliation. I mean, look, the problem you've got, I mean, she is an absolute catastrophe. I really do think she's like an existential threat to them. So they may well get rid of her. But the question is then who? So I've had two bets, and they're both very speculative, but they're the only two I can really think of. Which one, Rishi Sunak, because Sunak is at least vindicated here, right? And they need someone who would pacify the markets. Sunak will pacify the markets, right? And there's a story to tell that he was vindicated, right? So back to him at 10-1. And you may laugh, but I had a small bet at 220-1 on Theresa May, because I can see a situation where they need a caretaker. I really don't see who the alternative is going to take over from Truss, but at least May is seen as competent. She might be able to pacify the markets, and the rivals wouldn't object to her because they know she has no long-term ambition.
Tessa?
No, because I think something that's easy to forget now because of what's happening and the discussions around removing Truss is that a large part of her vote and why she won amongst the party members was because there was a real distrust of Rishi Sunak and those who had removed Boris Johnson. And I think Tory MPs know that they would have to be mad to rile up their own members by now removing Liz Truss before the next general election. I agree she's a bit of an existential crisis for them, but not even really because of what she's doing now, but because if Labour wins a massive majority, you will see a lot of potential leadership candidates, including, you know, senior Tory MPs, losing their seats. And therefore, if they lose the next general election and they do face maybe not as big a wipeout as the 33% poll lead suggests, but if they do face the kind of wipeout similar to what Labour did at the last election, they're going to be scrambling around for leadership candidates to follow her. And I suspect they will end up with a lot of people who have the experience gone, and they'll be back to scraping the barrel.
Interesting. I mean, I'm of the opinion that depending on how long this level of lead holds, because Labour are now, I can't believe I'm saying it, 20 points ahead, wait for it, on average with Politico. I don't know how long Tory MPs can tolerate that for. I think it's very much, as we've discussed before on the show, Paul, they are ruthless when it comes to removing underperformer or an existential threat. And it is getting into this sort of territory where, and I know she's only been in office for 2 weeks, but the longer they keep Truss, the more they'll be permanently associated, which is the same problem they had with Johnson, in the sense that in the end it took them that long to remove him, and the party's ratings and their underlying ratings stayed low, gave Labour that platform and that lead. Now it's ballooning. But I've got no idea about who might win or run in that race to replace her, or who would even want to. I've had a couple of speculative bets, nothing bets, I must admit, on the next Tory leader. One is Michael Gove, and there's a serious bit of thinking into this, in the sense that this could be a situation where he's not running against anybody more popular than him, because everybody more popular than him doesn't want to take control of this and have the most immense salvage job, only to then be, say, 10 points behind Starmer's Labour and almost certain to be kicked out of office. And also, I think Gove has enough respect in the party in terms of people who are seen by Conservative standards as capable and able to stay the ship. And the other one is, and again, I've no idea if he'd run, and his seat's in real danger, admittedly. But Dominic Raab has been called in to put out fires of various strikes over the last couple of years. He was the actual stand-in for Boris Johnson when he was sick with COVID. And if there is to be sort of an appointed caretaker, if there is to be, and again, this is a huge constitutional thing, right? But let's say they go and they do the thing they used to do in the 60s, and go to the palace, just have somebody appointed. Are Gove and Raab 66-1 to be either the two picked? I don't think so. And Theresa May is also not a free figure price to be chosen in that situation. But my belief currently is that if there was to be a Conservative Party leadership contest, it's a bit like it'd be a bit like the England job before Southgate came along. Does anybody really want it? Or all you're going to do is get screamed at, eventually lose, and be sort of a bad footnote in history, and you've got nothing to work with either.
I just can't see how they can have a full-blown leadership contest again. That would, I mean, part of the problem they've got now is precisely because they have, firstly, delayed reaction to things because of the leadership contest, not coming with a plan, and created hostages to fortune in that leadership contest. So if they replace her, which is not certain, but I just can't get my head around her running an election campaign. I just can't. I mean, the local elections next year are going to, assuming she is still there in May, they're a bad set of local elections for the Tories anyway, those seats. You know, that could be just absolutely catastrophic. So in that situation, I just think they would have to be a coronation. And I think Gove's a good call, actually. Gove would be one of the few people who might be seen as both competent and able to unify the party.
It's interesting that both of you have kind of gone with two bets that do feel like caretaker roles, or even Sunak to an extent because of what he's done before. So it doesn't seem like either of you believe there's any value in like a genuine contest and therefore a genuine leader. You're just both looking for someone to almost steady the ship to inevitably lose at the next election, and maybe not lose that badly. So then, as Tessa said, maybe you don't lose so many seats, so you can then have a proper leadership election.
Yeah, totally. I mean, Paul also raised a point there. The party seniors, if there is to be even any sort of contest, it will be very much rushed and hurried. People will be dissuaded from applying. That's if they even wanted to, right? And I'll get to that in a moment. And I do not think you're going to get a sort of beauty contest of a lot of fancy names joining in. I think if Sunak was to run, then the price he is really, really big. He's a sort of bet to nothing. You're betting on him going for it, possibly, in a hypothetical situation where there's a very short leadership contest or where everybody says, okay, can we have somebody here for this, please? But I just wonder if politically he'll think it's too toxic. I just wonder if he might be tempted by sort of goings on elsewhere. I know he's still an MP, but if he's thinking of the longer game, and he might well be, you know, it takes MPs on average about 10 years, I think, to become Prime Minister. Sunak's been there for 3. He might well think the election after the next is the time to make a bold bid for it and stay low for a little time in the meanwhile. We've seen money on Boris Johnson, which I both get and don't get. I get the idea, if there's to be a membership thing, he's very popular with the membership. Sure. The only thing I don't get is, have we all forgotten that he's sort of the reason why the Tories are here? His ratings haven't changed. The public perception of him hasn't changed. And also, why would the MPs who walked out en masse just go back and do that the next time? And he wouldn't settle the markets anyway. You know, I just can't believe that in the middle of a gilt yield sell-off or, you know, a pension fund disaster, that people would see Boris Johnson sort of walking back into number 10 as a stable influence. Kemi Badenoch is somebody who's mentioned to be quite a bit, and I think at some point in the future, sure, she surely can't want this. Mordaunt surely can't want this. I don't believe anybody can really want this if they want to be the Prime Minister who sticks around. So that's what thinking on Caretaker. Tessa, you rightly pointed out that going back would be really, really tricky, to say the least, for the Tories electorally. Do you think there's anybody in mind, possibly, that if Truss goes, could end up being put in or might decide to give it a go?
I think anyone with their head screwed on properly will realise that it's a poison chalice. Because, I mean, for example, if Rishi Sunak was put in a Caretaker PM, firstly, I don't think he'd even go for that. But secondly, can you imagine the hatred from his own party members who see him as part of the reason Boris was removed, then lost to Liz Truss, albeit not as heavily as many said, only to have Truss removed and Rishi put in as Caretaker PM, probably just in time for a very rough general election. You know, even if he is, you know, the Caretaker Prime Minister, the Tories will have suffered such damage to their brand by then. I think even anyone they put in, I don't think it's enough. And I just really don't see Truss being removed before the next general election, because I think most of the Tory party know this. I agree with the others that there will be no leadership election. If it does happen, someone will be put in. If people thought that the last leadership election was a bloodbath, imagine what it'll be like if Liz Truss is removed. You know, and again, it will be back to the Labour Party posters writing themselves. I really don't see anyone, not just who can do it sufficiently to kind of save the Tories from an election loss, but I also don't see anyone who would want to do it. Especially, I mean, if you're Theresa May, sure, some Tory grandees and things might think she'd be the perfect choice, you know, but she'll probably thinking, I don't want to be back there again, you know, in the snake pit. She already had a few years of that. This would be so much worse than it ever was during the Brexit years for a Tory Prime Minister, for anyone to come in as caretaker after Liz Truss. There is one option for the Tory party, and I don't know if this is what they're pursuing, but they do have one option, which is to carry on with giving out this sort of meat to their members in terms of the low tax stuff, and this is their plan for growth, and do the unpopular stuff now and hope that the public forgets it by the time of general election. So spend the next 6 months doing all the post-leadership win, here's everything I promise, blah, blah, blah. And then pivoting back to levelling up Boris Johnson style stuff that won them in 2019. However, I think their credibility will be shredded by then if they do that anyway. And the other problem is that I don't think their economic plans for growth are going to work, because I mean they're already not working. They're having the opposite impact that was intended. So I don't think we're going to see the returns on growth within the next 2 years, and I don't think people are going to see it in their wallets either, in their household budgets. So it is an option to do the unpopular stuff now and then throw out some big ticket items before a general election, but I don't think it's enough. I think they'll shredded their credibility by then. I think to a certain extent, a lot of that damage has been done this week, and they're not going to be able to reverse it anytime soon.
Quite a devastating thing to end on if you happen to be a Tory supporter or back for the next election. Thanks very much for your time, Chris, Paul and Tessa, and thanks very much to you for watching. As a bonus, I spoke to Emma Burnell of the Fabians yesterday about some of these questions, and you'll be able to see that interview right after this. But thank you very much for watching The Polling Station, and we'll see you again next week. Great to be joined by Emma Burnell, who was kind enough to join us in Liverpool. The conference has ended. Give us a quick overview now that we've seen everything for you and for Labour.
Well, everyone, and I'm very lucky to count my friends across the Labour spectrum, from hard left to very centrist, and practically all of them, even those who were very disappointed that Labour shifted away from Corbynism, were saying that felt like the best conference they'd been at since Labour was in government. Just in terms of the professionalism of the conference, the atmosphere, there's a real sense of forward momentum, a real sense that, and I think what's interesting is that Keir managed to do what I have been trying to get the Labour Party to do for a really long time, which is take some quite left-wing economics and present it as common sense, steady as she goes centrism, which it is. Meanwhile, Liz Truss is presenting incredibly right-wing economics as headbanger revolution. So it's like the parties have completely flipped their stances since the 2019 election, and I think Labour just felt like it had a spring in its step that it hasn't had for so long. I mean, even the full spring we had in our step under Ed Miliband didn't feel like this.
And that's a really interesting point in comparison for Miliband, particularly as there were times when the poll lead was this big. And
not this big, but
not quite this big, but of large enough size.
I mean, I think what the difference is under Miliband, we had a Labour poll lead, but we didn't have a poll lead on those underlying fundamentals. They didn't trust us on the economy. They didn't trust, sadly, Ed to be the right leader. So we never really got that best leader part, which is really what you are asking the country in a general election. Who do you want to be Prime Minister? However much about 650 separate elections, actually, we know that's how it works. And the economy argument is so important. And the fact that the Tories have dropped like a stone just in a week is extraordinary. And I think potentially unrecoverable. We're talking about last Friday being as seismic and as damaging as Black Wednesday. And I'm old enough to remember that. Unlike you, whippersnapper.
I'll take that gladly. Now it feels a bit odd to be talking about and reviewing a Labour conference whilst everything has been put in motion by the self-inflicted choices of the government. But let's talk a little bit about the Starmer Truss clash. And let's also talk a little bit about Tory party dynamics, because there was a fear, I think, in some quarters that Liz Truss would be harder for Keir Starmer to beat than Boris Johnson because the personality match didn't go as well, because that narrative had been sort of turned asunder. Now there is the prospect, despite the fact she's been in office only 2 years, that Truss is in possible danger. No chance, unless things change.
Yeah, the Tories just seem to be ungovernable, I think. They've got to that point where they're tired of being in charge, and you can just smell that. Do you know what I mean? So they just constantly fight amongst themselves, and endlessly looking for the new person at the top, when actually it's the fundamentals that are the problem. It's Toryism that the country is turning against. And in some ways, it's actually better. Boris Johnson was slippery. He didn't stand for much. I prefer a straight fight against Liz Truss, actually setting up our values against their values in the clearest possible terms. And I think that's a fight that Labour can win elementally.
Liz Truss is 1 to 2 with us, 66% or so, to face a confidence vote at any point before the next election. Do you think, if you had to say yes or no, do you think it'd happen?
I think I said to you last time, a week ago, I'd have said that was mad. It's still mad, but it's quite likely.
Yeah, I mean, we've been here before with letters. I personally gave up believing that there was a threshold that Boris Johnson was going to push to. But
there is, I mean, there are all these, everyone goes, oh, well, there are these rules that mean that can't happen. It's like every single time the Tories have lost a leader, it's been against the rules, technically. We can't have a vote of no confidence. We had one 12 months ago. We have to wait 12 months. Yeah, that didn't happen. Same thing with Theresa May. Once the party turns on you, they turn on you. The problem is the parliamentary party and the party in the country are in two very different places. And so the parliamentary party can say, oh, no, we need it. Unless they get behind one single candidate, which I can't see this very fractious parliamentary party doing, they will then offer two very different candidates to the country. The country will come back with a different answer than the parliamentary party wanted, and we'll just go around the merry-go-round again.
Speaking of the merry-go-round again, assuming it would happen, who do you think might be willing to take this? Well, it's going to look like a very poisoned chalice now. Rishi Sunak is amazingly currently favoured with us. Do you have any names in mind that you think would be willing even to put their hat in the ring? And who do you think might become a contender?
Never bet against Michael Gove. That's my strong sense. Kept his hands clean, kept out of the cabinet, waiting in the wings, ready to take over.
33 to 1 shot. He has drifted to a rather big price. That's the biggest I can remember seeing go for a Tory leadership race at this sort of stage for it. Last but not least, Rishi Sunak is favourite. Boris Johnson, of all people, was second favourite. What would your reaction be?
The parliamentary party put Johnson back in? That's the question we have to ask ourselves, because we are so stupid sometimes in going, well, what I want is X, so I'm going to vote, I'm going to bet on it. Or what? It's quite obvious the right answer is Y, without thinking about the process steps. And the process steps have to be factored into this. I don't see a party who, I mean, I can't see how Boris Johnson gets a cabinet. So if you can't get a cabinet, you can't govern. So I just honestly, I don't know who or how. I don't see it being Boris. If it's anyone, I think it's either Gove or possibly Kemi Badenoch. She might be, weirdly, the unity candidate. But if I were Kemi Badenoch, I'd be running for the hills right now and just saying, you know what, it's not my time yet. I've proved my worth, but I'm going to wait until it's a lot more favourable.
Yeah, I mean, I can imagine plenty thinking
Whereas
that.
Michael Gove might be thinking, you know what, last roll of the dice.
Yeah, I do think it's something to consider. I mean, it's absolutely ridiculous that, gosh, I think it's not even close to 100 days since the end of the Tories. I think she's been in office 2 weeks, and there was a little coronation handover period, and we are looking at the possibility of another.
And how does she dig her way out of that? Like, even if she has a good conference, I still don't think that changes the fundamentals. And I don't see her having a good conference. Liz Truss is that most difficult of things, it seems to me. She's a bad politician who's also an unlucky politician. And you need to have talent or luck, or preferably both. When you have neither, that feels very fatal.
Indeed. I think that's a really good place to end this on, although I'm sure not for the Tories.
Not for Truss.
Not for Truss, no. But that said, given that this supercut of all her interviews is out there, I think we might not be the most painful listening for us today. Emma Burnell, thank you so much.
Thanks, William.